This is just tequila.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate Blue People. I appreciate Capital Factory for inviting me. And of course, I will tell you a little bit more about the language of design and how it changed the way my brain works. But first, maybe an introduction. I am Daniel Domene. You probably have seen my name for 15 times, so you're tired of it. I was raised in Guadalajara, Mexico, which is the home of mariachi and tequila. I've been a software developer since 1996. I started selling software when I was in elementary school-ish. Sadly, no. And then I spent 23 years at National Instruments where I did driver development. I was a UX engineer. I was a manager for a little while there. I was technical product manager and finally distinguished product architect until very recently. And I'm also a storyteller, mentor, and public speaker. And that means that we have the tech, and we have the tequila, and we have the talk. So it looks like we're in the right place for this. Perfect. Now, I really believe that it's a privilege to create products for people who use their hands to make the world a better place. And so I feel a responsibility to them to make products that will improve their quality of life. Because when you improve the quality of life of people who work, when they get home, their families benefit, and then their friends and families benefit. And it's just a positive net impact on the world if we make products that make people's jobs better and more enjoyable. And it is so good to make software for people who have honest work. It's very nice. Not talking about Zuckerberg. All right, we are gonna start with the power of language here. And I'm gonna start with a hypothesis. Language shapes the culture and the way that we think. And I'm gonna prove that to you through an example. Let's start about Spanish and English. If you look for the word love in English, of course, it's love. Everybody knows what love means here because we're in the US, that's great. We also have that word in Spanish, it's called amor. But languages tend to have as many words as they need for terms that they care the most about. So in Spanish, there is another word for love called cariño, and there is another word for love called querer. In fact, there are more words for love, I just didn't have any more slides. And that shows up in multiple places. When you look at people dancing, if you go to Latin American countries, dancing is very intimate, it's very sensual, there is a lot of contact. If you go to English-speaking countries, it's more like grab your beer and say yes with your head and don't touch anybody. And that really, because love is reserved for your significant other and everybody else is just a buddy. Whereas in Spanish, there is all these layers and levels of love. So that's how it shows up. And so now I have proven, of course, that language shapes culture. But you guys don't seem convinced. So it's fine, I have more. I'll give you more proof. Now, German and English. I speak both. I learned a lot of things from both languages. So English and German have very different, slightly different grammars. German is a little bit more complicated. English has one article, the. German has three. And then there is, sorry, I miscropped this. As I said, slightly more complicated than English. There are all these cases, and it depends on the prepositions and the verbs, and the endings of the words change. It's a whole deal. It's very complex. And that complexity shows up in how they approach the world. We used to have an office in Germany, and in the kitchen of that office, there was this little control panel. And in this little control panel, open to everybody, no lock, no door, there is no glass in front of it. You can do a few things like, I don't know, turn off the power to the entire building, or turn off the lights to the entire building. Why not? You can cut off the water. You can also turn off the lights in individual rooms. And of course, you can lock all your co-workers in their offices because you can lock all the doors from the kitchen. Can you imagine what would happen if they did that here? Of course, in the US, because we can do that, we have this very, very high-end technology to replace that. It's called a switch. And the switch is never labeled. And we love to have a lot of them, and they show up in multiple rooms. And if you want to do anything other than turn on the lights to that room, you have to go to the electrical room that has a key. And if you don't have it, that's it. Because we cannot deal with complexity as well as Germans can. And of course, we can't even deal with good UX because the light means the switch is off instead of it being the other way around, and it bothers me every day in my house. Now, I have proven it, right? Okay, I still see skeptical faces. It's fine. I have one last example that should put this to rest. And I'm gonna talk about left or right. In fact, we're gonna talk about Purrumpah, Australia. specifically about Dr. Lira Boroditsky, who is a cognitive science professor at the University of California, San Diego. And she has been studying a lot about languages, and she spent a lot of time in this little village in Northern Australia, where they have a distinguishing characteristic. They don't have a concept of left and right. They have a concept of north, south, east, west. Everything is cardinality. So they don't have a right leg. This is my north leg. Well, now it's my west leg. And they just know. And then when you tell them to order pictures in order, they will always go north to south. And if you twist them, then it's a diagonal. For them, it just makes sense. It's always north to south is how stories flow. That's it. And I want her to explain to you a little bit more about why that is and what that means for her.
I had this cool experience when I was there. I was trying to stay oriented because people were treating me like I was pretty stupid for not being oriented, and that hurt. So I was trying to keep track of which way is which. And one day I was walking along and I was just staring at the ground. And all of a sudden I noticed that there was a new window that had popped up in my mind. And it was like a little bird's eye view of the landscape that I was walking through, and I was a little red dot that was moving across the landscape. And then when I turned, this little window stayed locked on the landscape, but it turned in my mind's eye. And as soon as I saw that happen, I thought, oh, this makes it so much easier. Now I can stay oriented. And I kind of sheepishly confessed this to someone there. I said, this weird thing happened. I saw this bird's eye view and I was this little red dot. And they said, well, of course, how else would you do it?
And so living there and learning their language basically gave her superpowers. Her mind is a little video game. She can just see the orientation of everything, and she knew that this was her north arm. I don't, which is what I didn't even know where north is, but let's assume this is north. So now, hopefully, I have proven this for you. But we haven't talked about why. Why is it that words change fundamentally how our brain works? And it starts with the most basic thing. Words have semantic and emotional meaning. When you store a word in your head, it not only describes your history, so the nouns and adjectives tell you how you feel about it. We can all think that 2020 is a great or a bad year, but depending on how you store it in your head, it can be a terrible year or just a bad year. And based on how you store it and how you tell yourself that story is how you feel about that year. That is very powerful that words have that attachment. In the same way that grammar also changes how you think. We are all, in Western societies, we tend to think about there is a subject, and there is an action, and there is an object, because that's how our grammar is structured. And our ideas flow in that way. Those are the tools that we have, and the ideas that we have to put on paper all flow in that same way. Who did it? What did they do? To whom? That's the power of language. Of course, that means that words are not describing our history, they're defining our history, because how we store them actually changes what we think about it. And I have two quick examples of how words really change the way you think. One, a few years ago, I stopped saying the word lady to refer to a woman, because lady has this social connotation of fragility and and it's weird because you never hear somebody say, oh, ask that lord over there what he thinks. Ask that man over there. But it's always, oh, ask the lady. And turns out, if I really want equality, there's a man and there's a woman, and neither of them is a bad word. And changing that have a huge impact in how I behave with women, which is so great. Being an engineer, not a lot of experience. Now, my other example, of course, is the F word. If you've noticed, immigrants, when I first came to the US, I would sprinkle the F word like the Salt Bay on everything. And that's because the F word is just a word. It had no emotional connotation. I was never bullied with the F word. I was never insulted with it when I was growing up. It's just a word. And because it doesn't have that meaning, I could just use it. And then over time, it acquired a meaning. And this is why I use it less, except when necessary. Now, what that means is that a new language actually gives you space to grow, because you have all of these new words to call reality. Reality is the same, but by using new words, it also has the basis for you to attach new emotions and new ideas. And if you change the grammar, it also how you think. It's that process, right? But I did promise you a little bit of superpowers. in the abstract it said about seeing the future. So in order to tell you about the future, first we have to jump on the time machine and jump to the past. Back in the year 2015, I joined the product design team. My boss is actually here, sitting in the audience. And in that team, instead of being surrounded by engineers, all of a sudden I was surrounded by designers. And even though we spoke the same language and we used mostly the same words, something weird was going on. Because every time I asked a question, instead of answering the question like an engineer would, maybe not so verbose, hopefully, they answered with another question. And not only that, but they would keep doing that over and over and over again. I just did not realize why. Can you just be straightforward and tell me what the answer is? And that's when I realized that designers really just think differently. That's what they do. It's their brain is wired differently. Not because they are weird, but because their profession actually has given them tools that I didn't have. So to talk about that language of design, first I want to define a little bit how a language is created to be able to tell this story. And specifically, out of all the definitions of language from the dictionary, we're gonna focus on this one: the phraseology and vocabulary of a certain profession, domain, or group of people. All of you in your jobs have a specific language that you use to communicate, and that is that language. And where does that language come? How does a language start? It starts with purpose. If you're a soccer player, your purpose, of course, is to score a goal. And to achieve that purpose, you need a process. The process for soccer, you have the plays, you will do the dribbling, you have to follow the rules, you try to shoot, etc. But to be able to plan that strategy, you need to be able to talk about it. And that's where the language comes from. The language comes out of the necessity of describing the process so that we can achieve the purpose. So to understand the language of design, we have to start with the purpose of design. And as I said, I worked with amazing designers, so of course I just went to my favorite designer and asked, what is the purpose of design? And she gave me a very straightforward answer. Intentionally, thoughtfully, and authentically improve communication and experience in everything we touch, see, and do every day. Clear as mud. So I did not get that, so I had to go look for another designer. Don't tell them that they were not my favorite designer. And I asked for something maybe a little bit more concise. And what they told me was, it is about enabling user success, even when nobody knows what success looks like. That I can wrap my head around. It's a little bit easier for me to understand. Okay, so if that's the purpose, what is the process of doing that? And when you're gonna do design, they have to start by sifting through a whole lot of information. And not all of that information is really that useful. Everything from what product managers are saying, what the other engineers are saying, what the customers may say. Customers will tell you, this is what I need. And that's a solution, it's not the actual problem. And they have to sift through all of that and dig all the way down to get to the root of the problem, where they understand, okay, this is what is actually missing. This is what the design needs to solve, right? And then, as they're doing that, to be able to understand what everybody's talking about, because designers are not the engineers, they're not in that field, they still have to learn everything, which is amazing. They have to build this very broad understanding. Designers today have to learn about LLMs and cloud and mobile browsers, and they have to know everything about user context. They need to learn a ton of information. And then they have to listen to every idea and every opinion. Believe me, when you work with engineers, there's a lot of those. And they have to listen to all of them. And then they have to start digging down by asking questions. And then they'll try to find, okay, what was the last time you did this, and how did this come about? Tell me more about this. How does this affect it? And through that, they start to challenge the assumptions. Because engineers were really good at saying, this is the answer. This is what we were taught. Get to the answer quickly, that's it. And there's a lot of assumptions in that. And designers have to break through those and say, okay, that's fine. However, what if that were not the case? Then what is it? And then once they have this entire big problem space already laid all out, now they have to start narrowing it down to something we can actually do. All right, what are we actually going to work on out of all the problems we found? Because you will find, you start talking to people, they'll find all of the problems. And then they have to narrow down to, this is what we're gonna work on. Great. Once it's been narrowed, the next step in the process is now exploring solutions. And this is where everything explodes again. They go flying pigs here. They start thinking about all the possible ways that this can be solved. And then there is a lot of iteration where you share it and get feedback about it. And as you're sharing and getting feedback, you start refining and narrowing. And then at some point you have something that looks like a solution, so you have to test it, and test it, and test it, and test it. You have to go put it in front of customers. And they have to do all of this, and designers will go and actually sit in front of the customers and let them struggle through the software, and then ask questions and figure out what is it that it needs to be added or not. And after they did all of that, now they have this one great design. But they're not done, because otherwise it would be too easy. All of this is something you can just do, right? Because this design, you have to convince somebody to actually pay for it. So they have to take this beautiful little design, this, the apple of their eye, and they have to put it in front of stakeholders. And stakeholders, they don't always view design positively. Stakeholders have a critical eye towards it. They're trying to poke holes in it. They're trying to figure out, can we afford this? What is this? I don't like this, right? And sometimes that means that it will just not happen, and they have to go back to the explorations and pull the next thing and iterate again to get to something, right? But a lot of times, through that process, we end up agreeing on something that needs to be built. And to do all of this, the thing I admire the most, designers do this over and over and over again, and they don't quit. That's the most Zen thing I've ever heard. It's like running against a wall, because I've been the stakeholder on this, and believe me, it's like running against a brick wall over and over, and then you just go back for more. It's crazy. So that is the process, but I'm still talking. So what is the language of design? Fine, let me tell you. The design language is full of active listening. There has to be a lot of emotional intelligence, because a lot of the context is not in the surface. You have to know which questions to ask. You need to look at people's reaction. You need to look at how people feel about it. And getting emotions into a professional environment is hard. So they have to do all of this. Then there are all the open questions. And then it's both ambiguous and precise at different points, which was so weird for me to get, but I'll get to it in a second. So questions, of course, sound like, what are the users trying to achieve? What happened before this? And how often do users do this? Do we need to do this? What if? Why? Typically you don't ask why, because that's rude, but anyway. But it is also ambiguous and precise, because you have to be ambiguous to be able to talk about a solution without getting lost in the details. The worst thing you can do to an engineer is tell them, this is what the solution is, because they'll just look at everything that can't work and find all the ways that that won't work. So you have to start with something like, the user can, through an interaction, get to a place where they can see the status of their system. So it's very ambiguous. You're not saying what it actually is. You're saying what it can do, so that you can have a conversation about it. And then you start getting more and more specific, to the point where the level of precision you need when you're actually putting a design together. Is this going to be a combo box or a drop-down? What color is it going to be? Obviously never black. And is it a find? Is it a search? And this entire process has been one of the frameworks for understanding it. It's called the Double Diamond by the Design Council of the UK. It's fantastic, where you go from discovering up and then into this to define it, and then out to explore and develop, and then in to actually deliver something. And that double diamond is design thinking. And it's called design thinking precisely because even though it's a process, it will change the way you think. And I will show you that in a minute. But I bet you keep asking, what about seeing the future? This is not truth in advertisement, I know. But don't worry, I'm going to give you the best cliche ever. The best way to predict the future is to invent it. No, I'm messing with you there. Obviously, I would not stand here and just tell you that, because that's ridiculous. And don't worry, this is only slide 91 of 122. So we have time to get to that. So let's look at my brain. It's scary, I know. Bear with me. My brain on engineering, I'm a monotasker, I'm observant, I'm methodical, I'm practical, minimalistic. I'm very impatient because everything should just work already. Stop it. Right? Stop talking about it, just do it. As I learned design and as I work with designers, I developed this other side of my brain that is more of a multitasker, cooperative multitasker, because I'm still a guy, so I can't actually multitask. But it's better at multitasking. I'm braver, I am a lot more patient, I'm introspective, and I am a lot more comfortable with ambiguity. Now, because I have these two sides, does it mean that now I have a switch? And I can say, I'm going to use my engineering brain, or I'm going to use my design brain, and I can just turn it on and off. That is not exactly how it works, and for that, I'm going to bring it back to Dr. Lira, who will explain to us.
What turns out to be the case is that it's something in between, that bilinguals don't really turn off the languages they're not using when they're not using them. So even if I'm speaking English, the distinctions that I've learned in speaking Russian, for example, are still active in my mind to some extent. But they're more active if I'm actually speaking Russian. So bilinguals are kind of this in-between case where they can't quite turn off their other languages, but they become more prominent, more salient when you're actually speaking the language or surrounded by the language.
So it's not a switch. It's more like a secret blend of spices. It's a KFC of brains that I have now. You know? And thinking like a designer will add to the way I view the world. And it allows me to pay attention to different things. Yes, I can still focus like an engineer and just go code and then realize that I did it wrong. And sometimes I can try to look at the problem before I start coding, which is pretty nice. And I don't lose what I had, but I can shift my focus better. Learning German gave me the same thing. I can be very descriptive and very methodical when talking, when I need to. English gave me like the practicality, right? I can be very succinct when I want to clearly. Believe me, I can. And then Spanish gives me this verbosity and this just, you know, the feeling that I put into what I say. I get all of that from the languages. And so out of the language of design, I learned great things like there is a customer that is different from a user. And more importantly, I'm neither of them. That's important. I am a lot less afraid of being wrong because I know that my first idea is usually wrong, and that's fine. I am no longer married to the ideas, which means I also know when to just let go of an entire approach. And I can be working on something for a long time and now just say, that is no longer relevant, throw away those slides, start something else. Because I program in PowerPoint nowadays, so hence slides. And I'm also a lot better at seeing the bigger picture now, because I pay more attention. And through that is that I can see the future. And I will give you an example, I'll show you what that means before we finish, by starting first with what would it look like just planning with an engineer in mind. We're gonna put a completely hypothetical scenario here. Let's say you have to manage the short-term backlog of a, let's say, cybersecurity company. As I said, completely hypothetical. And you have a couple of vulnerabilities to look at. You also have users reporting that DNS filtering is hard to configure. And then somebody in QA reported that blue screens when the definitions file is empty. As an engineer, I would look at this and say, all right, so I need to evaluate these individually, right? I look at the first one and say, well, XXE is something for XML in Adobe. Not a lot of users. Priority 2. SolarWinds, oh man, my boss is gonna want this fixed, so priority 1. Users report configuring DNS filtering is cumbersome. No, it's not. Users are dumb. Reject. We're still selling, right? Are we still selling? Great. We don't need to fix it. And then QA reports blue screen when definition file empty. Well, duh, don't do that. And then I tried it, and if you reboot, it just fixes itself. So that's it, reject. We don't need to fix it. Cut to, of course, completely hypothetical. Things can go wrong when you have that mindset, right? And you don't want to be in the news for that reason. You want the news to be boring. So let's see what that same planning would look like with a hybrid brain. Same hypothetical company, same vulnerabilities, let's work through them, right? With my designer brain, I would start by asking questions. What actually happens with XSE vulnerability? Is remote execution. Okay, then that means I can escalate privileges, that's pretty bad. What about the SolarWinds was? Okay, improper file access for some folders. So as long as they don't put files there, no problem. Huh. Now, users report configuring DNS filtering is cumbersome. I'm not the user, so clearly I don't understand why they're struggling, so this needs research. And then, if QA is reporting blue screens, first, do we have a process to make sure that we don't get blue screens out? And second, how hard is it to reboot the system? I would like to know that. So, I go and answer those questions and realize, all right, remote execution, bad, priority 1. Improper file access, priority 2 is fine. The DNS, we should refer that to the design team. They should do research and then come back with a new design, and then we'll implement it. I don't have to think about it. It's not my job. It's fine. Go. And then for the blue screen, well, if there is no process, I need to notify the DevOps team. And if rebooting is very hard, which it is, if you're in a virtual machine or data center, then this should be escalated immediately. But I did say hybrid. And because I have a hybrid brain and not just a designer brain, I can look at that last one and be, maybe there is something else I could do. Maybe I could just fix it. Like checking for null before I open the file. And just do that. And not blue screen the machines. Revolutionary. And I have time to do that because I'm not doing the DNS thing. And it turns out that the XXC vulnerability is smaller than the SolarWind one. So I have time to go and implement this, and it's done. And by tomorrow morning, this will never be an issue. Cut to boring news. Nobody has to worry about it. It doesn't matter. I'm not on the news. My CEO is not on the news. Happiness all around. And that's because everybody has a story, and context really matters. If you understand the relationships between people, and if you understand what it means for them to do their job and the story of their job, what you're doing is you're feeding the right side of your brain. Sorry. You're feeding the right side of your brain. The right side of your brain evolved for social connections. The right side of your brain is great at finding patterns. That's what it's for. It evolved to tell you, don't say that in front of your mother-in-law, because you know what will happen. That's your side of your brain. That's what it is, right? And that means that it also allows you to anticipate the outcome of very complex chain of events. You know, maybe it's not the mother-in-law, it's the cousin, but only after the second paloma. So then you know, right? And so you can pay attention to all of these things, and that is entirely the right side of your brain. So if you start thinking about a problem with the entire context, all of a sudden, now you can actually see the future. And we have 5 minutes for questions. Thank you.